Ever feel like relationships are kind of like tougher to keep strong these days?
Yeah, definitely a lot of people feeling that way for sure.
That's what we're diving into today. Uh, why that is. So many people are talking about how tricky it can be to really connect nowadays.
Right, exactly. And we've been looking at some research that kind of gets into the reasons behind it. All these big changes in our society and how they play a role.
And that's what's so interesting. So I think, we're not just making this up. It's like there's actual stuff going on that's
Yeah.
making a difference, right? So
Yeah.
let's start unpacking some of these big changes and see what we can figure out.
Absolutely. So,
So, okay, first off, technology. I mean, it's got to be a huge factor, right? Like we're more connected than ever before in a way.
yeah, I mean,
Uh,
that's the thing. It's like this weird double-edged sword.
totally. Yeah.
Right. On one hand, we can talk to anyone anywhere instantly, but it's like, are we really connecting? You
Yeah.
know?
Right, right. It's like, are we sacrificing some of that deeper connection for like the convenience?
Exactly. And one of the big things the research pointed to is how much we lose when we're not face to face.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like, think about all those little cues we pick up on when we're with someone in person. Their
Yeah.
body language, their facial expressions, even just like a touch on the arm.
It's like a whole extra layer of communication, right?
Exactly. And that stuff just doesn't translate the same way through a screen.
Totally. And it's so easy to misinterpret things online too, like sarcasm, for instance, or even just genuine empathy.
Oh, yeah. Huge problem.
It's like a minefield trying to convey those subtle emotions through text or even like a quick voice note.
Right. And then in their social media, it's like this whole other beast.
Oh, man.
We're constantly bombarded with everyone's highlight reel, so it's easy to start comparing ourselves and feeling like we're not measuring up.
Absolutely. And I think that can really mess with our own relationships, because we start having these unrealistic expectations.
Definitely. And it makes us question, are we happy enough? Is our relationship exciting enough?
Yeah, it's like this constant pressure to like live up to this perfect image that doesn't even really exist.
Exactly. And I think that can make us lose sight of what's actually important. Yeah.
Totally. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about another big factor here, just like the pace of modern life.
Hmm.
It's like everyone's so busy all the time. How does that play into all this?
Well, I mean, when you're constantly rushing from one thing to the next, it's hard to make time for anything, let alone nurturing relationships.
Right, it's like relationships end up at the bottom of the to-do list.
Yeah, and it's not just the lack of time, it's also the stress that comes with it, Like when you're stressed out from work or just life in general, it's harder to be present and engaged with the people you care about.
So true. And then even when you do have time to spend together, it's like there's always these distractions, right?
Oh, yeah.
Constantly, phones, work, emails. It's like you can never fully switch off.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that really impacts the quality of the time you do have together. Even if you're physically in the same room, you might not actually be connecting on a deeper level.
It's like we're all so used to multitasking that we've forgotten how to just be present with another person.
Right, and I think that's a big loss,
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about technology and we've talked about the pace of life. What about some of the broader societal shifts that are happening?
Yeah.
Like how have our values and norms changed?
Well, one of the big things that stood out in the research was this shift away from the traditional emphasis on like lifelong commitment.
Interesting, yeah.
There's a much greater focus now on individual growth and self-discovery, which is great in a lot of ways, but it can also lead to people prioritizing their own needs above the needs of their relationships.
So it's like this tension between like me versus us.
Exactly. And I think that can make relationships feel less secure and less stable because it's like everyone's always looking out for number one.
Right. It's like that sense of like we're in this together kind of gets lost.
Yeah, and I think that can make it harder to work through challenges and disagreements because it's like people are quicker to give up rather than put in the effort to fix things.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about another big factor that's often overlooked, the impact of stress and mental health.
Yeah.
How does that play into our relationships?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that mental health issues are on the rise, and that can definitely put a strain on relationships.
Yeah.
Like when you're struggling with anxiety or depression or any other mental health challenge, it can be really hard to show up for your partner or your friends and family the way you want to.
Right. It's like you're dealing with so much internally that you don't have the energy or the emotional bandwidth to give to others.
Exactly. And it can also make it harder to communicate effectively, you know? Like if you're feeling overwhelmed and anxious, you might be more likely to snap at your partner or withdraw completely.
Totally. And then that just creates more distance and more tension in the relationship.
Right. And it can become this vicious cycle, you know? Like the more stressed and disconnected you feel, the harder it is to reach out and connect with others.
Okay, so let's go back to communication for a minute because I think this is a really crucial piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
You know, how has the way we communicate changed? And how is that impacting our relationships?
Well, one of the biggest changes is just the sheer volume of communication we're exposed to these days, you know? Like we're constantly bombarded with messages and notifications, and it can be really overwhelming.
Totally. And I think that makes it harder to focus on like the quality of our communication,
Yeah,
you know?
exactly. It's like we're so used to these quick, superficial exchanges that we've forgotten how to have real, meaningful conversations.
Like we're communicating in sound bites instead of full sentences.
Right. And that can be really detrimental to relationships because it's like you're never really getting below the surface, you know?
You're not really taking the time to understand each other's perspectives and work through things together.
Exactly. And that can lead to a lot of misunderstandings and resentment.
Totally. Okay. So circling back to social media for a minute, how does that play into our communication patterns?
Well, I think social media encourages us to present this idealized version of ourselves in our relationships. You know, it's all about like the perfect photos and the witty captions.
Right. It's like we're all trying to create this perfect narrative for the world to see.
Exactly. And that can make it hard to be vulnerable and authentic in our real life relationships because it's like we're so used to putting on this facade.
It's like we're afraid to let people see the messy reality behind the scenes.
Right. And I think that can prevent us from forming truly deep and meaningful connections.
Okay, so last but not least, let's talk about this idea of a disposable mentality when it comes to relationships. You know, this idea that it's easier to just walk away than to put in the work to fix things.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting trend, and I think it speaks to a lot of the anxieties that people have around commitment and vulnerability.
Right. It's like people are afraid of getting hurt, so they'd rather just avoid the risk altogether.
Exactly, and I think social media plays a role here too, because it's like we're constantly exposed to this image of like endless options and
It's
possibilities.
like the grass is always greener syndrome.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that can make it tempting to just jump from one relationship to the next without really giving any of them a chance to grow and deepen.
Right. It's like we're treating relationships like disposable products instead of something that's worth investing in and fighting for.
Exactly. And I think that's a really sad thing because it's like we're missing out on the opportunity to experience true intimacy and connection.
So to wrap things up, it sounds like there's a lot of different factors contributing to this perceived weakening of relationships.
Yeah.
You know, it's not just one thing. It's like this complex interplay of technology and societal norms and mental health and communication patterns and our own fears and insecurities.
Exactly. It's like all these things are feeding into each other and creating this really challenging environment for relationships to thrive in.
So what can we do about it?
Yeah.
You know, like how can we strengthen our relationships in spite of all these challenges?
Well, I think the first step is just being aware of these challenges, you know? Like once you understand the forces at play, you can start to make more conscious choices about how you interact with others.
Right. It's like knowledge is power.
Exactly. And then I think it's about prioritizing your relationships, you
Mhm.
know? Like making a conscious effort to carve out time for the people you care about and to really be present with them when you are together.
So it's like putting down the phone and having a real conversation.
Exactly. And it's about being willing to be vulnerable and to work through challenges together, you know? Like relationships aren't always easy, but they're so worth the effort.
Totally. Okay, so here's a final thought for you to chew on as you go about your day. Think about one relationship that's really important to you and ask yourself, what's one small thing you can do today to nurture that connection? You know,
Mhm.
maybe it's sending a thoughtful text message or making plans to spend some quality time together or just simply listening with your full attention the next time you talk to them. It doesn't have to be anything big, but just one small gesture to show that you care.
I love that idea. Yeah, just one small step in the right direction.
Exactly, because even small things can make a big difference when it comes to relationships.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Until next time.
See you later.